Well, I do hope you can hear me. If you can't, well, there's not much we can do about it. But anyway, I want to talk to you tonight. The title I was given, God Who Blesses the Earth, Care for Creation as Liturgical Action. First of all, a matter of words. Christians should speak of the creation, not of the environment. Because environment implies that the world is around us, we're the centre, and this is a hidden assumption in much contemporary discourse. The psalmist wrote, "The earth is the Lord's." I'm going to read you a little bit from Psalm 24, which you will all know very well. "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. He's founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? Who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false and does not swear deceitfully." Now, these verses alone would make a good basis for creation care. Creation care, by the way, is the American name for what we're doing. A good basis for creation care, acknowledging the Creator, keeping the seas and rivers clean, and not dealing with falsehood and deceit. But tonight I want to explore the biblical idea of the earth as a temple and human beings as the high priests of that temple. The Bible has a beautiful and sophisticated account of the creation and the role of human beings, but this is not set out in a single text. Both in the biblical stories of creation and in the design of the Jerusalem temple, there is a single vision of the relationship between time and eternity, between God and creation, between the visible world and the invisible world of God and the angels. And to understand what the Bible says about the creation, we too must glimpse the vision that informed the worship of the temple, the poetry of the Hebrew prophets, the sayings of the wise men, the images of the storytellers. All express and honour the same truth about the creation. And since the New Testament shares this view of the creation, it is the basis of any characteristically Christian view of the creation, what is popularly called the environment. So I'm going to talk around the 7 heads that you will have on your little handout there. First of all, very important to remember, the temple in Jerusalem represented the creation. That doesn't mean that the people believed the earth was flat or that it was shaped like a loaf or anything like that. It's simply a mind map. And the Genesis story of the 6 days of creation also described the ceremonial building of the temple. The temple was in 2 parts, divided by the Great Curtain. Now, this is widely attested in Jewish tradition and assumed in a lot of Christian writings too. The outer area of the temple represented the visible material world, and the inner part, the Holy of Holies, was the invisible world of the glory of God and the angels, heaven, speaking loosely. Now, this pattern is ancient, and you can see this by comparing Genesis 1 and Exodus 40. We could spend the rest of the evening just doing this, but I'll show you how it works, and then this is something you can perhaps do for yourselves if you want to. Genesis chapter 1 is the 6 days of creation. Exodus chapter 40, and you want the last half of the chapter, what would have been the last column of the scroll. And you can see that as Moses assembles the tabernacle, and the people have made, it's a kind of prefab, people have made all the bits beforehand. It's a ritual, ceremonial assembling of the place of worship. And as the tabernacle is assembled, So the various pieces of the tabernacle correspond to the 6 days of creation. So the second action of assembling the tabernacle is putting the great curtain in place. That corresponds to the second day of creation, which is assembling the firmament, the rachiach, that separates what is above from what is below. That's the first indication we have that the outer part of the temple, what we would call the nave, they called the great hall, the hekal, that represents the earth. The Holy of Holies behind the curtain represents the invisible presence of God. And the whole thing was assembled as at the beginning of the new year. And the New Year ceremonies in the temple were all about cleansing and renewing and restoring and preparing for the rest of the year. You can go through and you can see how, for example, the golden table with the bread and the wine and the incense on it, that represented the third day, it was the third action, and these are all things that come from the trees and the plants. And then the fourth day is the lights of heaven, and that's the great menorah and so forth. So it works through. It's very easy to do. It's you can simply play snap. It's not a very sophisticated process. Now, the curtain represented the matter that concealed the glory of God from human eyes. And the important thing here is that the Holy of Holies in the heart of the temple shows that the divine presence is at the heart of the creation. We have these images that come into our mind from all this wonderful Western art of God somehow up there, and the ascension, you see Jesus' feet going up through the ceiling. Now, that's wonderful art. It's very bad theology. The Holy of Holies in the heart of the temple show that God is at the heart of creation, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment. All worship in the temple concerned the relationship of the creation to God. Praise, thanksgiving, asking for forgiveness. And the whole of the visible world was thought to be a temple where the human beings were the priests. That is very important. That is a fundamental of Christian creation theology. Now, Adam, and the name simply means a human being. It's not gendered. Adam was put in Eden to serve and to preserve. And that's the commission that's given in Genesis chapter 2. And these are two Hebrew words which are actually technical terms for worship in the temple. To serve literally is the word we still use. It's serving a liturgy. It's a priestly term. And to preserve is preserving the teachings. And so Adam, from the words that he used, the Hebrew words that he used in Genesis, Adam is put into the garden. Adam is put into the material world to serve it as a high priest. And indeed, in Jewish tradition, Adam was remembered as the first high priest of creation, not as the steward. Now, I'm sure you have all heard good sermons and talks and all the rest of it about Adam as the steward of creation. That is not a biblical concept. Now, you can have good sermons from bad exegesis. We all know that. That doesn't justify bad exegesis. Adam is the high priest. There is no hint of a business relationship. Adam is not the steward. There had been an ancient covenant with Adam, and this is only mentioned in the Old Testament once. It comes elsewhere in Jewish tradition, but in the canonical texts, it's only hinted at, mentioned once, and this is in Hosea chapter 6, where we read, I desire steadfast love. That's a very important word for creation theology. Steadfast love, it's the Hebrew word chesed. It doesn't really have a precise translation. I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. But like Adam, they have transgressed the covenant. They have dealt faithlessly with me. And that is the only time that the covenant with Adam breaks the surface, if you like, in the canonical texts. There is the original covenant is the covenant of chesed, the covenant of loving kindness, And these were the terms on which Adam was entrusted with the creation. So after 6 days, according to Genesis, God rests on the seventh, showing that when creation was complete and it was very good, nothing more was made. And so the goal of creation is not more and more, but sufficiency, completion, and rest. Now that is a hugely countercultural view today, because if we have an economy that is flatlining, oh my goodness, we're heading for disaster. But we cannot go on more and more and more. The pot will soon be empty if we haven't destroyed it by then. So this idea that the goal is not more and more, this is a biblical view, and it is profoundly countercultural, as is a great deal of Christian creation theology. And looking specifically to the earliest Christian links, of course, the sixth day when creation is completed is linked to Good Friday, the sixth day of the week. And then there's the rest. And then the Sunday is the first day and the eighth day. And the early Christian writers had a lot to say about that. Something was completed on the afternoon of Good Friday, and it's the new creation. So the second point, the whole of creation, that is earth and heaven, all things visible and invisible, as we say in the Creed, is bound together in a network of bonds known as a covenant. Now, because of the history of modern biblical scholarship, which was largely developed and pioneered by Protestants, there was a huge emphasis, a distorting emphasis, on the covenant with Moses. The covenant with Moses, in the broader tradition, is actually a subsection of something much bigger. The underlying concept of creation in the Hebrew Scriptures and coming through into the New Testament is something which is called the eternal covenant, the Berit Olam, or the covenant of peace, the Berit Shalom. And you imagine this as a network of bonds that holds the system together. Now, badly taught, the Moses covenant is like one of Donald Trump's deals. You keep my rules and I'll see you're all right. That is a small subsection. The basic meaning of covenant is something that holds the structure together. And eternal, the eternal covenant, means that the bonds bind everything to the hidden presence of God. That's very important. And then peace is the usual translation of the Hebrew word shalom. That just means wholeness or integrity, everything as God intended it to be. And so the covenant of peace, which is the same as the covenant of eternity, it's the same thing. In the time of Jesus, and we know this from the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was called the covenant of chesed. It was the covenant of loving kindness. This is the basis upon which all things hold together. And so everything, the visible natural world, human society, and the invisible world of the bodiless powers, the angels, was part of one system created by God. Now, I'm sure you all know the Benedicite. We don't sing it very often, do we now? But the Benedicite is very interesting because if you look at it carefully, you'll see that the first half of the Benedicite is about the invisible powers, and you get halfway through before you find, oh, let the earth bless the Lord. So this wonderful exhortation of all creation to praise recognises the invisible world and the visible world part of one system. And the bonds held everything together and joined to the visible world to God at the centre. And then they believed that this covenant was sealed by the name and by those who bore the name. Now, the name of the Lord, the sacred name in the Hebrew Scriptures, was represented by a cross, which I'm sure will not surprise you. It was a diagonal cross. We know this from the book of Ezekiel. And they said that the bonds of creation are sealed by the name of the Lord and by those who bear that name. Think of Christian baptism. Any action which broke the bonds was by definition sin. So you couldn't have a committee to revise the definitions of sin. It's what we're having nowadays. Everything that broke those bonds was sin. Human conduct could and did destroy the system. And sin could be deliberate or through ignorance, but the effect was the same. If you broke a bond and you said, "Oh, but I didn't know," then that was culpable ignorance. So one of the key roles of the priests and the angels, and in the temple, the two are very difficult to distinguish. The priest dressed in white linen, the high priest particularly, and he was seen as an angel messenger. So the angels and the priests, this is why we draw angels wearing white now, because they wear, well, until Victorian angels, and then they wore colours to match the curtains. But before, well, it's true, but before that they wore white, and this was the dress of the Holy of Holies, and this was the sign of the high priest, and the priests were the angels. And one of their roles, they had two roles. One of them was to teach about right conduct and right thinking. And breaking away from God, breaking away from that eternal covenant, was not seen as liberation, which it is nowadays, of course, freedom to do as you like, but as deprivation, losing touch with the source of life and renewal. Now, the mystics whose writings we read among the Dead Sea Scrolls, they described the Holy of Holies, the invisible world of the divine powers, as the mystery of existence, the mystery of becoming, that invisible state, not above the bright blue sky, but in the heart of creation, from which all things come. And when the bonds of this great covenant broken, the whole system collapsed. Stars fell from the sky, the sun lost its sight, all these familiar pictures. And these pictures of the apocalypse are how the prophets and the poets imagined the result of a breaking of the covenant on a massive scale. Now, this is not a biblical image, but if you imagine a spider's web, a multi-dimensional spider's web, is something that we used to do when we were kids, and you can break one or two bits of the spider's web, and the spider's web will still stay there. But there comes a point where you poke the last bond and the whole thing goes, doesn't it? Now, this is the picture you have in the prophets. It's rather better expressed than that. The system can stay with a limited amount of sin, but when there is wholesale sin, the system collapses. Now, this is Isaiah chapter 24, and I'll just read you verses 4 and 6. Now, when are we going to date this? Well, before 700, so we can't say it's news. Okay, Isaiah 24, verse 4. The earth mourns and withers. The world languishes and withers. The heavens languish together with the earth. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed the laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse devours the earth. Its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. The inhabitants of the earth are scorched, and few are left. That's frightening. That's the earliest picture we have, this is the great Isaiah, of the consequences of destroying the creation. And then go on a century or so, and a couple of bits from Jeremiah. I mean, we could spend literally a week on this. Jeremiah chapter 4. This is about the abuse of knowledge, and we shall come on to this in a minute. My people are foolish, they know me not. They are stupid children, they have no understanding. They are skilled in doing evil. How to do good, they know not. And then, in his vision, Jeremiah goes back to the beginning of Genesis before there was any creation. He says, I looked on the earth, and lo, it was waste and void. Those are the very words you get at the beginning of Genesis. Lo, it was waste and void. I looked at the heavens, and they had no light. I looked on the mountains, and they were quaking. All the hills moved to and fro. I looked, and there was no man, and all the birds of the air had fled. Do you remember Silent Spring, Rachel Carson? That was her trigger, wasn't it? I looked, and lo, the fruitful land was a desert. The cities were laid in ruins. Why? Because my people are foolish. They are skilled in doing evil. That needs no further comment. Now, the eternal covenant, this great covenant, was repaired by a ritual in the temple that was called Atonement. And this is when the temple, which represented the creation, was symbolically purified from the effects of sin. Now, by symbolically purifying the temple, the high priest is actually purifying the creation that this temple represents. And before you could be included in the great ritual of the Day of Atonement, you had several days in which to repent and put right all the terrible sins you had done and any things you hadn't attended to, and if your ox had broken your neighbour's fence, you had to get that repaired. You didn't just say sorry, you put it right, and you paid a fine. And when everyone had done all they could to clean up their own mess, then they could be included in this great ritual of atonement, when the effect of sin is removed and the creation is renewed for the new year. Now, since this is a Christian gathering, and you have to be very careful when you expound the Bible and you're not sure who your audience is, but this is a Christian gathering, I can link this to Good Friday. Leviticus 16 verse 8. Well, Leviticus 16 is the original prescriptions for the Day of Atonement. If you go and read it, you think, oh my goodness, what a muddle. Well, the answer is yes, because people have added bits over the centuries and so forth. But the biggest problem is verse 8, which is invariably not translated correctly, and we know for a fact that the early Christians read it differently. Now, this is when Aaron the high priest has got the 2 goats ready for the Day of Atonement. And these 2 goats, one of them is going to be sent off as the scapegoat, carrying away all the sins of Israel. The other one is going to be sacrificed. And the blood of that goat was the blood, and blood in the temple symbolises life, not death. Remember that. It's life, not death. He takes the blood, the life of that goat, and this symbolises the life of the Lord. And the life of the Lord is taken into the Holy of Holies, and it is then used to remove the sins from creation and to heal and restore, to cleanse and consecrate from all the sins of the people of Israel. That's quoting. Now, the problem verse, Aaron shall cast lots upon the 2 goats, one lot for the Lord, the other lot for Azazel, leader of the demons. That's a huge problem. What are they doing, making a sacrifice to the leader of the demons? Well, the answer is that's not what it means. This little Hebrew word, just an L at the beginning, actually means one lot as the Lord, one lot as Azazel. Azazel is banished, and the goat that represents the Lord is sacrificed. And so the creation is renewed by the sacrifice of the Lord. And that, of course, underlies Good Friday. And so this whole ritual for repairing the creation is a priestly ritual. It involves repentance and self-sacrifice to renew and restore everything that's been damaged. That can be the creation, the person's relationship with God. And so, reading from Romans 12, this is where Paul gets to the practical implications of what he's been arguing in the first 11 chapters. He says, I appeal to you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. So we pour out our lives in our living. And then he goes on, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. So it's quite clear where it starts. So, point 3, the Holy of Holies is a unity because God is one. And this unity underlines and binds together in one system everything. Now, I haven't mentioned the beginning of creation yet, which in all the ancient texts is not the first day. It is day one, because day one is outside time, it's outside any temporal sequence. And so you look in the Hebrew original, you look in the early Greek translation, day one. Day one is the underlying unity that is beyond and outside, but nevertheless in the midst of all the visible creation. And the prophets, and the wise men indeed, glimpse this in their visions. I will just read you one much mistranslated verse, but this is a literal translation. Proverbs 29:18. And you don't need a sequence in Proverbs at this point because it's just a series of bits. Proverbs 29:18, where there is no prophetic vision, the people unravel. That's what it says literally. If you lose your prophetic vision of what is at the centre, everything unravels. Proverbs 29:18, that is a literal translation. Now, the people on earth are able to learn something about God from the angels, brackets, priests, and the angels are themselves part of the glory and unity of God. And this is the context in which we think of the ideas of inspiration, making connections, research, discoveries. These are all things that are there and that we discover. And the idea of patenting life processes and all this kind of stuff that's going on in a world that's run by mammon is absolutely anathema. So the gift of joining together is the gift of seeing the bonds of the covenant. And the song of the angels symbolised the harmony of all creation centred on God. And when the people on earth praise the Creator, then we say this, don't we? Angels and archangels and all the company of heaven. We are the angels on earth and we become part of the great pattern of creation. And you all know the song of the angels at Bethlehem. Glory to God in the highest and on earth. You could finish it for yourselves. This is creation theology. And the harmony and the shalom of creation are maintained by obedience. Now, the pattern of creation, this is point 4 on your handout, and I'm mindful of the clock. Methodist preachers are used to working in a room where there is a big clock that can be seen by the preacher but not the congregation. The pattern of creation is determined by God and is described as the statutes, the engraved things. And when the earth is in harmony with these divine statutes, the natural world and human society enjoy justice and righteousness. Justice and righteousness, they're technical covenant terms, much abused, particularly in evangelical Christian preaching. But they are very important for describing the processes that arise from the covenant of chesed, the covenant of loving kindness, covenant of peace, eternal covenant, the creation covenant. You start with chesed as your premise. You don't argue for that. That is the loving kindness, however you're going to translate it. It's not mercy, it's not love, it's something in between. If your premise is chesed, then this leads to right judgment, in Hebrew mishpat. Right judgment leads to right action, which means putting things right, and that is the word that's usually translated righteousness, zedek zedakah. That word righteousness, and then having had the right premise, made the right decision, taken the right action, the result is shalom, peace. And that's the vision that is how things work within this creation. Now, this word zedek, putting things right, this in fact is the name of the high priest. We all know about Zadok, the high priest. Well, that's not his name, that's his job description. And he is the one who is there to put things right, first by his teaching, and then second, of course, he presides as the great high priest over this ritual of atonement when the earth is renewed. The exact measurements and proportions and roles of everything in the creation are planned by God, and these were known as the mysteries of creation. And if you read the mystical Hebrew texts about the mystics who went up, stood by the throne of God and looked out and saw all the creation and where it was going wrong and so forth, they're fascinating things to read. You will find that the mysteries is the same word as the measurements, the midot. And these are not simply cosmic dimensions. This is not just somebody kind of playing with numbers, although they did do that. It meant even fair dealings in weights and measures. There's a remarkable passage in Ezekiel 43 and then in Ezekiel 45 saying that if you have a society that distorts its trading standards, then you have a distorted temple. Everything is wrong. And so you have this picture that everything, including mundane things like weights and measures, what happens in the markets, all of this is part of the just and proper measurements of the creation. And the aim is to keep everything within the plan of the Creator. And again, lines you know well, thy kingdom come, namely, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's what the second line means. So, that's point 4. Point 5. Humans are created as the image of God on earth. There's no statue of the Lord in the temple in Jerusalem. Human beings as the image of God, and that, of course, is the basis of all Christian social ethics. People worshipped God by their treatment of other human beings and by their care for the creation. Parable of the sheep and the goats is the obvious one there, Matthew 25. But humans as the image also meant that people had to care for the creation in the way that God cares. And here, I'll introduce you to something. One of the tools of the trade is temple discourse. They played with words. And nowhere is this more interesting than in the description of Adam. Now, Adam apparently is told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the world and subdue it. Oh my goodness, what problems that translation has caused. Each of these words is actually wordplay. So when Adam is told to be fruitful, that could also mean be glorious. When Adam is told to multiply, it also means to be great. He is supposed, therefore, to be glorious and to fill the earth with glory. And if you look at the picture of Adam in New Testament times, the kind of context for the origins of Christianity, Adam is described as a great and glorious being. And then have dominion and subdue. Dominion, the word ravah, used of King Solomon. He holds his kingdom in peace and everyone prospers. It does not mean just trample. It can mean trample, but it doesn't have to. Subdue, that's an interesting one. That means to harness, to bind everything in one. That's a very different picture of Adam, but look what we have got in, and I'll just give you one example. Or perhaps two. Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, which is the hymn of the cosmic Christ. For in him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. That's the picture, the early Christian hymn, the Cosmic Christ. Ephesians 4, verse 3. in all lowliness and meekness, patience, forbearing one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The bond of peace there is a reference to this covenant of peace, the Berit Shalom. Now, Genesis says that Adam was created from the dust. Genesis 2 began his real life when God breathed into him. Now, I suspect that this was actually a temple ritual because there were rituals in the temple for transforming a human being into an angel and Emmanuel and so forth. But when Adam was created, he was forbidden to take the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, secular knowledge. All the other trees, including the tree of life, which was the tree that gave wisdom. That's not said in Genesis, but that's all through the book of Proverbs, for example. All the other trees, including the tree of life, were permitted. Now, Satan, described in Revelation as the great deceiver, made the forbidden knowledge look attractive, persuaded Adam and Eve to eat the forbidden fruit, and they soon discovered the consequences of secular knowledge, materialism and reductionism. And they became no more than the dust from which they had been made, and they couldn't live in the presence of God. These old stories are very carefully worded. Now, the curse on the humans who had taken from the forbidden tree was, dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. That is a curse. That is not a materialist lifestyle aspiration, which is what it has become. So, dust thou art, to dust thou shalt return is the curse. Now, the tree of life is the symbol of wisdom, God-given knowledge. This God-given knowledge binds all creation in harmony to the Creator. And then some angels, we get this just a bit in the Hebrew scriptures, we get it more in the non-canonical texts. Some angels, who are known as the sons of God, rebelled against God, brought their heavenly knowledge to earth, but without the law of God. We're going to do it our own way. And the story is that they corrupted the creation by teaching secular knowledge, which fragmented and destroyed. And theirs was the deceptive false covenant, they were called the sons of God, offering a freedom that led to death and decay. Now, Paul, at the heart of his exposition, the heart of Paul's gospel, of course, is Romans 5-8. And in Romans chapter 8, Paul teaches that Christians are the new sons of God who are to set creation free from these bonds of decay, in other words, the counter-covenant that leads nowhere, and to restore the covenant of Shalom. Now, Romans chapter 8, all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God, and then the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of him who subjected it in hope. Creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God, the whole creation groaning in travail together until now, etc., etc., etc. Paul states clearly there that the first sign of being born again, to use the evangelical term, the first of the fruits of the Spirit is that we set creation free from its bondage to decay. We are the new sons of God. We are charged with renewing and restoring the great covenant creation. And St. John symbolizes this when he's writing in Revelation, and the first letter, the letter to the church at Ephesus, this is Revelation 2 verse 7, to him who conquers, now that word can mean conquer or be faithful, to him who conquers I will grant to eat again of the tree of life which is in the paradise of God. So part of the Christian narrative of the New Testament is undoing Genesis 2 and 3. We are back, the children of God eat from the tree of wisdom. And this is hugely important for any policy of Christian education. Very, very important. And then the last thing, going from the Holy of Holies, there is only one God, and to worship anything else is idolatry. Now, idolatry is not just, making statues and things like that. Isaiah's definition of idolatry is anything that is made by human beings. And this can be an economic or a political system. And we all know what happens when you make your religion around an economic or political system. Idolatry gives a false centre to the creation, and so this warps and distorts the whole system. The illustration I sometimes use here is if you can imagine the hub of a bike wheel that isn't in the middle, and some of the spokes don't get there and some get bent and all the rest of it, it no longer works. So if you have a false centre, the system doesn't work. And the second of the 10 Commandments warns that idolatry results in iniquity. Now, the Hebrew word for iniquity is literally distortion, alon. And so when you have that bit, I will visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children until the 3rd and 4th generation. That's not God being horrible and zapping people who don't do as they're told, which is how it's sometimes presented. It means that if one generation distorts the system, they distort it for future generations. And you only have to look at the effect of communist economics and all that. I don't have to explain this. You just look around, you read your papers. So the distortions of one generation affect the future. You do not just distort for yourself. And then, last of all, I have to finish with the book of Revelation. Very, very important. When the kingdom is established on earth, this is right in the middle of the book of Revelation, and the way that book is put together, that means it's the important bit. And this is how the kingdom is proclaimed on earth. We give thanks to thee, Lord God Almighty, and so forth. The time has come for the dead to be judged, for rewarding thy servants, the prophets and saints, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth. And part of the kingdom hope for Christians is that we cannot establish the kingdom until we have destroyed what destroys the earth. That's Christian creation theology.